The church had gone so quiet you could hear people breathing. That was the moment she chose. Not after the service. Not outside by the cars. Not later, when grief had at least been given the dignity of time. Right there. While my grandfather's casket was still at the front of the room. Melissa Hart stood up, turned toward me in front of everyone, and shouted the one thing no decent person would ever say at a funeral. "Where's the will?" For a second, nobody moved. Not my family. Not the pastor. Not the people in the back row who had known my grandfather longer than Melissa had even lived near his land. She stood there like she had just exposed some great lie. Like the 900 acres my family had worked for generations were suddenly a public debate because she decided grief was the perfect time to challenge me. I remember looking at her, then at the faces around the room, and realizing this was not really about mourning anymore. She wanted the land. And she thought a funeral was where she could break me before the paperwork had a chance to speak. She was wrong. My name is Caleb Mercer, and the reason Melissa Hart's voice hit that room so hard had nothing to do with volume. It was timing. Anybody can be cruel in a meeting. Petty in an email. Aggressive over a fence line or a board vote. But it takes a special kind of hunger to stand up in a church, with a family still trying to bury one of its own, and turn grief into a land dispute before the flowers have even started to fade. That was Melissa. She never rushed into conflict without a reason. She just waited for the moment when other people were weakest, then acted like pressure was the same thing as truth. Around the HOA, that had worked for her for years. She questioned permits, challenged property lines, talked about community interests, and treated hesitation like permission. Most people got tired before she did. Most people folded just to stop hearing her voice. My grandfather never did. That was part of why she hated him. He owned land the development had been circling for years. 900 acres of old family ground stretching beyond the clean sidewalks and decorative stone walls of the subdivision. Fields, tree lines, water access, cattle pasture, old fencing, and a western boundary that mattered more than most residents understood. To them, it looked like empty space beside a growing neighborhood. To my grandfather, it was history. Work. Leverage. The one thing he refused to let the HOA treat like future common area just because newer people liked the view. Melissa took that personally. She had tried every soft version first. Friendly questions about future access. Quiet comments about walking trails. HOA language about shared community benefits. Then came the harder version. Boundary talk. Development rumors. Little suggestions that a single heir might not be able to hold land that size for long. Every conversation sounded casual on the surface, but the meaning under it was always the same. Sell. Step back. Let the HOA shape what comes next. My grandfather never gave her that opening while he was alive. So when she stood up at the funeral and demanded the will in front of everyone, I understood something before the rest of the room did. She was not grieving. She was moving. And in her mind, death had finally created the weakness she had been waiting for. The room did not react all at once. That was what made the moment feel even colder. First came the silence. Then the turn of heads. Then the slow realization spreading row by row that Melissa had not just spoken out of place. She had crossed a line so ugly that even people who barely knew my grandfather could feel it. The pastor stopped mid-breath. My aunt lowered her eyes. One of the older men from the back pew actually took his glasses off like he needed to make sure he had heard her correctly. And Melissa just stood there, chin lifted, waiting. That was the part one remember most clearly. She was not embarrassed. She was not emotional. She was not some grieving neighbor who had lost control for a second. She looked prepared. Like she had rehearsed that question. Like she had decided the funeral was not a place of mourning, but a stage where she could force me into uncertainty before my family had even made it to the graveside. Where's the will? She said it again, not louder, but sharper. As if repeating it would turn cruelty into legitimacy. I could feel everyone in the church looking at me then. Not because they doubted me. Because they wanted to know what kind of man speaks after something like that. Melissa thought she had me cornered. She thought grief would make me slow. She thought if she raised doubt publicly, the land would stop feeling like inheritance and start feeling like an opportunity. In her mind, she was probably already halfway to the next move. Board pressure. Legal noise. Quiet rumors that the estate was unstable. Anything that could make 900 acres look less like family ground and more like something vulnerable. What she did not understand was simple. The will was never the weak point. My grandfather planned everything. He always had. He planned fencing before storms hit. He planned cattle rotation 2 seasons ahead. He planned taxes, drainage, water rights, equipment cycles, and every conversation he ever had with the HOA once he realized they were not admiring the land anymore. They were measuring it. And if he had spent years refusing to let Melissa talk him out of those acres while he was alive, there was no chance he had left death to chance either. So I stood up slowly, looked straight at her in front of the whole church, and said the only thing that made sense in that moment. This is a funeral. That should have ended it. It didn't. Melissa did not sit down. That told me everything. A decent person, once reminded where she was, would have felt the room and stepped back. Even if pride got in the way, shame would have done something. A glance downward. A muttered apology. At the very least, silence. Melissa gave none of that. She stayed standing in black heels beside the pew like she was not interrupting a funeral, but correcting an administrative error before it got too expensive for the neighborhood. She said the family had no right to hide the will if land transfers affecting the community were already underway. That was the phrase she chose. Affecting the community. Not affecting my family. Not affecting the estate. Not affecting the people sitting there trying to say goodbye to the man in the casket at the front of the church. The community. She was already talking like the HOA had standing inside my grandfather's death. That was when the temperature in the room changed. My uncle stood up first. Not fast. Just enough to make it clear that Melissa was no longer talking into polite silence. Then one of the older ranchers from the back row rose too, hands folded in front of him, expression flat. The pastor stepped away from the pulpit. Even people who had spent years avoiding HOA politics could finally see what this really was. Not concern. Not legal caution. Predation dressed in procedural language. Melissa saw it and made the mistake people like her always make when the room starts turning. She pushed harder. She said there were open questions about whether the acreage had been properly assigned, whether estate control was settled, and whether certain parcels near the development edge might still be subject to review before transfer. Might still be subject to review. She was trying to turn possibility into leverage right there between the hymns and the flowers. I remember looking at my grandfather's casket then, not because I needed strength from it, but because I suddenly understood something that made the whole thing clearer than grief had allowed a moment earlier. Melissa had not come to mourn. She had come to test the fence line while the gate was open. And if no one stopped her right there, she would walk out of that church and spend the next week telling anyone who would listen that even the family could not prove where the land was going. Before I could answer, the attorney stood up. He had been seated 3 rows behind my family the whole time, quiet in that careful way good estate lawyers usually are when grief is still in the room and paperwork can wait outside. Grey suit. Small folder on his lap. No need to perform authority because real authority never has to rush for attention. He stepped into the aisle, looked at Melissa once, then at the pastor, and said he would handle any legal questions after the service and only after the family was ready. That should have shut it down. But Melissa was too committed now. She said the board could not afford delay if the Mercer acreage was being transferred in a way that affected future community planning. She said residents had a right to know whether the land had truly passed to me or whether that claim was being made before probate was even settled. She kept talking like this was a zoning hearing instead of a funeral, and every extra sentence made the room colder. The attorney asked her a simple question. On whose authority are you demanding private estate documents in a church? Melissa actually lifted her chin when he said it. She replied that the HOA had standing to review any transfer that might impact shared boundaries, future access, or community development interests. That answer told me two things at once. First, she had come in prepared to use the funeral as pressure. Second, she still thought pressure and standing were the same thing. The attorney opened the folder in his hand and said the estate plan existed, the transfer structure existed, and any challenge to either would need to happen through lawful channels. Not through public harassment during a burial service. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The words themselves were enough. They carried the one thing Melissa did not have. Wait. Then he added one more line that changed her face for the first time all morning. The will is not your business. Not maybe. Not later. Not after community review. Not pending HOA concern. Just not your business. A woman near the front row let out a breath she had clearly been holding. My uncle took one step forward. The older rancher in the back folded his arms tighter. And Melissa, for the first time since she stood up, looked less like a woman exposing some hidden problem and more like exactly what she was. A bored bully who had mistaken a funeral for a weak point in the fence. Melissa sat down after that, but she did not retreat. That was what made the moment linger even after the service moved forward. She lowered herself back into the pew with the careful stiffness of someone who knew the room had turned but still refused to accept that she had lost it. No apology. No shame. Just silence sharpened into calculation. While the pastor resumed speaking and my family tried to pull the funeral back toward dignity, Melissa stayed perfectly still, eyes forward. Like she was already planning how to carry the same fight outside where flowers and grief would not slow her down. I felt it before we ever reached the cemetery. The service ended. People stood. Hands were shaken. Quiet condolences passed from row to row. But beneath all of it, there was a second current moving through the room now, something colder than mourning and harder to ignore. Everyone had seen what she did. More importantly, they had seen why. Not concern. Not confusion. Hunger. She wanted the land, and she had chosen the 1 hour she thought would leave me too raw to fight back. That was her mistake. Grief does strange things to people. Sometimes it weakens them. Sometimes it clears away everything except the truth. As we stepped out into the grey afternoon and the wind moved through the churchyard, I realized my grandfather had prepared me for this long before Melissa ever opened her mouth. Not with speeches. With habits. Keep copies. Keep records. Trust the deed, not the noise around it. And never let a person who wants your land define the moment before you define the facts. At the graveside, the attorney stayed close without crowding me. He said very little, only that the transfer documents were secure, the estate structure was clean, and Melissa had no legal standing to demand a thing from me. I nodded, but my eyes were on her across the burial ground. She was standing with two board-friendly residents, talking in that low, rapid way she used when she wanted gossip to harden into strategy before anyone else could interrupt it. That was when I understood the funeral confrontation was not the whole attack. It was the opening shot. She had failed to break me in the church. So the next move would come through letters, rumors, meetings. And whatever version of my grandfather's death she thought she could bend into leverage before the county records and estate papers finished saying what they already said better than any of us ever could. Melissa did not wait a full day. By the time we were back from the cemetery, the first message had already hit my inbox. Not condolence. Not apology. An HOA notice. Subject line, estate clarification and community boundary review. I stared at it for a second with my tie still loose and dirt from the graveside still on my shoes. That was how fast she moved. She could not force the will out of me in the church, so she went straight to the next tool she trusted more than decency. Paper with a logo. The email was written in that polished HOA language she loved. It said the board had urgent community concerns about the Mercer acreage following the passing of the prior owner. It said any change in control of land bordering the development could trigger review of boundary interests, access assumptions, and future planning rights. Then, near the end, came the line that told me exactly who had written it. Until documentation is verified, no claimed heir should assume unrestricted authority over parcels affecting the community. Claimed heir. I read that twice. Not because I did not understand it. Because I understood it perfectly. Melissa had already started the rumor in writing. Not that I was grieving. Not that my grandfather had died. Not that the family was trying to get through a funeral with some dignity left intact. Her first move after the burial was to frame me as a man making claims before the law had caught up. That was strategic. Because once you get the word claimed into enough inboxes, some people start hearing doubt even where none exists. Claimed owner. Claimed heir. Claimed land. It was not about legal truth yet. It was about atmosphere. And atmosphere was Melissa's favorite weapon. I forwarded the notice to the attorney before I even took my coat off. He called me 15 minutes later and said the estate documents were already in motion, the transfer path was secure. And no HOA board member could create uncertainty just by writing like one existed. He also told me to save every message, every letter, every mention of the acreage from that point forward. So I started the file. The funeral email first. Then the older letters about shared boundary concerns. Then the trail access questions. Then the board notes about future community planning near the West Ridge. When I put them in order, the shape of it became impossible to miss. Melissa had not been reacting to my grandfather's death. She had been preparing for it. By the next morning, Melissa had turned one disgusting moment at a funeral into a full campaign. It started with emails. Then calls. Then quiet little conversations with the kind of residents who always confuse confidence with credibility if it arrives in the right tone. She was telling people the same thing in slightly different ways. That the acreage might not transfer cleanly. That certain boundary parcels could still be under review. That the HOA needed to protect itself before any heir started making irreversible decisions about land tied to future community interests. Future community interests. That phrase kept showing up. Not because it meant anything legal. Because it sounded big enough to make ordinary people stop asking the only question that mattered. What did the actual documents say? The answer to that, of course, was simple. They said the land was my grandfather's. They said the transfer plan was already structured. They said Melissa had no more right to review my inheritance than she had to interrupt a funeral and demand the will in front of a church full of mourners. But Melissa knew something most bullies in HOA politics know very well. Facts move slower than suspicion if nobody organizes them. So I organized faster. I spent the morning at the ranch office with 3 stacks on the desk in front of me. Estate papers in one pile. Land records in the second. HOA correspondence in the third. The attorney had already sent me copies of the trust structure, the transfer timeline, and the preliminary documents that would shut down any serious challenge the second they were read by somebody who actually mattered. The county parcel maps were clean. The deed chain was cleaner. 900 acres, tied to family ownership, with the exact edges Melissa kept circling in her emails already sitting in records older than her seat on the board. That should have been enough. But enough on paper is not always enough in a neighborhood where a woman like Melissa has had years to train people to react first and verify later. So I built something stronger than a defense. I built a timeline. The funeral interruption. The post-service email. The prior letters. The repeated references to future access and planning. The older messages hinting that one heir might not be able to hold land that size for long. Once I saw it laid out in order, the whole thing stopped looking emotional and started looking deliberate. She did not want clarity. She wanted pressure before clarity arrived. By the afternoon of the second day, the neighborhood was no longer whispering about my grandfather's death. It was whispering about the land. That was exactly what Melissa wanted. She did not need people to know the law. She only needed them to feel uncertainty before the law had a chance to speak clearly. That was why she kept using words like claimed, pending, possible review, future planning. None of it proved anything. But it kept the air unstable, and unstable air is where people like her do their best work. The problem for Melissa was that whispers traveled both ways. Once she started spreading doubt, other people started comparing notes. A ranch hand told me one resident had asked whether the HOA really expected to get a trail through the western edge if the estate got tied up. Another neighbor called to say Melissa had been talking for months about eventual access opportunities as if my grandfather's death had simply moved the schedule forward. A third person, quieter than the others, forwarded me an old board message where Melissa suggested the Mercer acreage might become negotiable once the estate changed hands. Negotiable. That word sat in my head for a long time. Because land is only negotiable to people who think grief weakens ownership. I added the message to the file and kept building. Then came the board notice. Special community meeting. Agenda, inheritance concerns, boundary review, development impacts. There it was. Out in the open at last. The funeral had been the emotional pressure. The emails had been the fog. The meeting was where she planned to turn both into something the HOA could wear like process instead of greed. I printed the notice, then laid out everything I had in one straight line across the desk. The funeral interruption. The first claimed heir email. The older access messages. The trail language. The negotiable remark. The county parcel maps. The trust paperwork. The attorney's confirmation. And then, for the first time since the church, I stopped seeing Melissa as just a cruel woman with bad timing. I saw the larger mistake she had made. She thought the fight was about whether I could prove the inheritance. It wasn't. The inheritance was solid. The real fight was whether she could survive what she had already put into writing once a room full of residents saw the pattern all at once and understood that the funeral outburst had not been grief. Talking. Or confusion, or even panic. It had been the first public crack in a land grab she thought nobody would be calm enough to map. The meeting started at 7, but Melissa was in the room before 6:30. That did not surprise me. People like her always arrive early when they think the room still belongs to them. It gives them time to arrange papers, choose seats, speak quietly to the right residents, and build the mood before the facts show up. By the time I walked in, she was already at the front table with 2 board members and the property manager, speaking in that calm, clip tone she used when she wanted ordinary people to mistake preparation for authority. The room was fuller than I expected. Not packed, but full enough to matter. Neighbors who usually avoided HOA meetings were there. 2 older couples from the east side. A man from the cul-de-sac who never showed up unless money was involved. One of the ranch-adjacent homeowners Melissa had been feeding rumors to for months. Even a few people who looked uncomfortable being there seemed to understand that this meeting was no longer about future planning or boundary clarity. It was about what Melissa had tried to turn my grandfather's death into. She opened with exactly the words I knew she would choose. Community concerns. Boundary uncertainty. Responsible review. She never said funeral. She never said where's the will. She never said she had shouted at a grieving family in a church because she smelled weakness and land in the same room. That was her talent. Strip away the ugliest part of the story, then replace it with policy language until the room forgets where the rot started. But the room had not forgotten. I could see it in the way people watched her. Not trusting. Measuring. Waiting. She clicked through a short packet of maps next, none of them stamped, none of them recorded. All of them the same kind of neat HOA visuals she had been using for months to blur the line between what the subdivision touched and what it actually owned. Colored boundaries. Path ideas. Perimeter concepts. The kind of paper that looks serious until someone sets a D beside it. Then she said the sentence that finally made the room go still. Before any heir takes irreversible action on land affecting community interests, the board has a duty to review all potential impacts. Any heir. Not Caleb. Not the Mercer estate. Any heir. She was still trying to make me sound temporary. That was when I opened my folder. I stood up without rushing and carried the folder to the front table. That changed the room faster than anything Melissa had said all night. Not because people knew what was inside. Because they knew what folders usually mean in HOA meetings. Proof. Dates. Paper that does not care who sounds polished when the microphone is on. Melissa saw it too. I could tell by the way her hand stopped moving over the corner of her packet for just a second before she forced herself back into that calm board president posture she had been wearing since before. I walked in. I set the first document in front of the property manager. Trust summary. Then the deed chain. Then the county parcel map. Then the estate attorney's letter confirming the transfer structure and naming me a successor beneficiary over the full 900 acres. No speeches. No grand reveal. Just one page after another, laid down in the same order Melissa had tried to tear them apart in public without ever seeing them. The property manager looked at the first page, then the second, then the map, and the shift in her face was immediate. She passed the deed chain to the board member on Melissa's left. He read the parcel description twice. The older man from the cul-de-sac leaned forward in his chair. Somebody near the back whispered something I could not hear, but I did not need to. The room had finally stopped listening to Melissa's tone and started listening to record numbers. Then I placed one more stack on the table. Her emails. The claimed heir language. The future access notes. The negotiables message. And finally, the printed copy of the funeral notice she had triggered with her own mouth when she stood in that church and demanded the will before the burial was even over. Melissa tried to interrupt then. She said the board still had a duty to review community impacts regardless of estate transfer. I looked at her and asked the only question that mattered now. Then why did you wait until the funeral to ask for documents you never had standing to review? That landed harder than the deed. Because legal paper can prove ownership. But timing proves motive. And the whole room knew it. Not one person there believed she had acted out of caution anymore. They had the trust letter in front of them. The parcel map. The recorded chain. And beside all of it, they had the pattern she thought would stay hidden if she kept wrapping it in HOA language long enough. What sat on that table was not confusion. It was intent. Melissa tried to answer, but the room had already moved past her first sentence. That was the part she did not understand quickly enough. For months, maybe years, she had survived by getting to the explanation before anyone else got to the facts. Tone first. Pressure first. Certainty first. It had probably worked often enough that she stopped noticing how much of her authority depended on people being too busy, too tired, or too polite to ask for proof in the moment. Now the proof was on the table. And the room was finally looking at it. She said the board had only been trying to protect the community from uncertainty around a major land transfer. She said any responsible HOA would review inheritance issues affecting neighboring acreage. She said no one had acted with bad intent. But bad intent was no longer the only problem. Timing was. Language was. Pattern was. One of the older residents in the second row asked why Melissa had used the phrase "claimed heir" in her email if the board had not reviewed a single estate document at that point. Another asked why she had referred to the acreage as a negotiable in an earlier board message if she truly believed the issue was still unresolved. A third wanted to know why a funeral had been the chosen moment to raise private legal questions if the board's concern was really procedural. Melissa kept trying to answer one question at a time. That was another mistake. Because the room was no longer hearing separate issues. It was hearing a line connecting all of them. The church interruption. The emails. The rumors. The meeting notice. The vague maps. The access language. Everything that had looked like scattered pressure before now sat in one visible chain with her voice running through the middle of it. The property manager read the attorney's letter again and quietly confirmed that the transfer structure was valid, recorded land rights were clear. And the HOA had no direct standing to challenge the inheritance on its own. That statement hit the room like a final lock turning. No standing. Not unclear. Not pending. No standing. After that, Melissa's words stopped sounding defensive and started sounding trapped. Every explanation pushed her back into the same wall. If she did not have standing, why had she acted like she did? If the board lacked authority, why did she pressure the family publicly? If the acreage was never negotiable, why had she spent months talking like it might become available once my grandfather was gone? By then, nobody in the room was asking whether I really inherited the land. They were asking what else Melissa had tried to move with confidence before checking whether the law moved with her. That was the moment the meeting stopped being about me. Up until then, Melissa had still been trying to frame the room around the acreage, the transfer, the supposed uncertainty she kept pretending justified her behavior. But the second resident started asking what else she had pushed through confidence alone, the land became background. The real subject at the front of the room was no longer inheritance. It was her judgment. And once a room full of homeowners starts questioning the judgment of the person who used to speak for all of them, power moves fast. A board member on Melissa's right asked the property manager whether the association had any formal policy allowing board officers to challenge private estate transfers bordering the community. The manager said no. Another board member asked whether the HOA had spent time, money, or legal review on the Mercer acreage based on Melissa's claims. The manager hesitated just long enough to make everyone notice, then said several internal discussions and planning drafts had been shaped by those assumptions. That answer landed hard. Because now residents were no longer just hearing about rude behavior at a funeral. They were hearing that Melissa's private obsession with my family's land may have already influenced HOA decisions behind closed doors. Trail concepts. Edge planning. Development assumptions. All of it suddenly looked different. Less like community leadership. More like one woman feeding the board a false future until enough people started treating it as real. A man near the back stood up and asked the question the room had been circling for the last 10 minutes. If she had no standing, ignored the estate documents, and used HOA language to pressure the family anyway, why is she still running this meeting? No one answered immediately. Melissa tried to speak, but the sound of her own voice had changed. It no longer carried the room. It no longer reset the mood just because she was the one speaking. Now it sounded like what it really was, one person trying to outtalk a record. The board member on her right asked for an internal vote to suspend her authority as president pending review. That was the first real crack. Not because the motion passed yet. Because it was spoken aloud. In HOA rooms, once removal enters the air, everything changes. People start reinterpreting old moments. Old emails. Old conflicts. They stop thinking about whether the president sounded confident and start thinking about how long they've been allowing confidence to replace proof. And sitting there with my grandfather's land records in front of them, that room was finally doing exactly that. Melissa tried to fight the motion the only way she knew how. She reached for tone. She said the board was overreacting. She said difficult inheritance questions always create emotion. She said the community needed steady leadership, not panic driven by one funeral, one family, and one misunderstanding about neighboring land. That word nearly made the room turn on her by itself. Misunderstanding. Not after the letters. Not after the emails. Not after the maps she had circulated. Not after standing in a church and demanding to see the will before the burial was even over. By then, nobody in that room believed she had misunderstood anything. The only question left was how far she had gone while pretending she had the right. The board member on her right asked whether she had ever informed the full board that the county clarification already existed before the funeral. Melissa said the documents had not been fully evaluated. He asked whether she had disclosed them at all. She tried to answer around it. The property manager finally spoke and said no such clarification had been included in the meeting materials Melissa distributed before the special session. That did it. Because now this was no longer just about pressure and bad judgment. Now it looked like concealment. A woman near the front row stood up and said she had trusted Melissa for years because she always sounded prepared. Then she looked at the packet on the table, the county map, the trust letter, the emails, and said prepared was not the same as honest. The room went quiet after that. Not waiting quiet. Settled quiet. The kind that comes when people stop trying to decide what happened and start deciding what they are willing to accept from the person in front of them. The motion to suspend Melissa from the presidency pending full review was called. Hands went up. Board first. Then resident support flooded the room before anyone even asked for it. Melissa sat there gripping the edge of the table, still trying to wear that same controlled expression, but it no longer fit her face. She looked like someone holding the shell of authority after the thing that powered it had already left. The vote passed. No shouting. No applause. Just a clean procedural result delivered in the plainest possible language. Melissa Hart was removed from the chair effective immediately, pending final review of conduct, misuse of HOA authority, and actions taken against the Mercer estate without standing. And sitting there in that fluorescent-lit room, with 900 acres of my family's ground resting quietly inside a stack of documents she never should have challenged in the first place. I realized she had finally lost the one thing she thought made her untouchable. Not the title. The room. By the time I walked out of the clubhouse, Melissa Hart was still inside, but the part of her that had mattered in the neighborhood was already gone. Not because she lost one vote. Because everyone had finally seen the mechanism. The sharp emails. The polished certainty. The way she wrapped greed in HOA language until ordinary people stopped hearing the greed at all. For years, that had been enough. Most residents were too busy to challenge every claim. Too tired to pull records. Too willing to believe that the loudest person at the front of the room must know more than they did. That was over. My grandfather's land had not changed. The 900 acres were still where they had always been. Fence lines, water, pasture, timber, road access. All of it sitting quietly under the same truth Melissa had tried to talk around since the day she realized the HOA could not grow any farther without running into Mercer ground. The difference now was simple. The room knew. A few residents came outside after me. One older man said he had lived there 10 years and never once thought to ask whether Melissa's community maps were real. A woman from the east side told me she was sorry the family had been forced to defend itself before the funeral flowers were even gone. None of them spoke like people discussing a technical land issue anymore. They spoke like owners who had just learned how easily a board can be bent by one person if nobody checks the paperwork soon enough. By the next morning, the board had already appointed an interim president. By noon, management sent notice that all prior communications involving the Mercer acreage were under review. By evening, Melissa's allies had stopped using words like misunderstanding and started using the one word they had tried hardest to avoid from the beginning. Standing. She never had it. Not at the funeral. Not in the emails. Not in the meeting. And once that became public, everything else she thought she controlled started falling with it. She wanted the will at the funeral because she thought grief would make me weak. Instead, grief made me careful. She thought 900 acres would look vulnerable without my grandfather standing in front of them. Instead, the land did what strong land always does. It outlasted the noise around it. I inherited 900 acres. Melissa inherited the consequences of asking the wrong question in the worst possible room, in front of the wrong witnesses. At exactly the moment when the truth was already on its way and all she had left to fight it with was a voice nobody in that neighborhood trusted anymore.